In the summer of 1941, Army Group Center stood as the most powerful military formation Germany had ever assembled. Under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, it comprised nearly 50 divisions, including 9 panzer divisions and 6 motorized infantry divisions. This force advanced over 400 miles into Soviet territory in less than 3 weeks during the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa. By late July, it had encircled and destroyed multiple Soviet armies, captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and stood within 200 miles of Moscow. The Red Army's Western Front had essentially ceased to exist as an organized force. German commanders believed they stood at the threshold of strategic victory. Army Group Center's momentum was not merely impressive, it was strategically essential. The German plan for defeating the Soviet Union depended on achieving victory before winter, before Soviet industrial capacity could be fully mobilized, and before the Wehrmacht's limited fuel and equipment reserves were exhausted. Operation Barbarossa was designed around a specific theory of victory. German planners believed the Soviet Union could be defeated through the rapid destruction of the Red Army in Western Russia, preventing Soviet forces from retreating into the vast interior where German logistics could not follow. The plan divided German forces into 3 army groups. Army Group North would advance toward Leningrad. Army Group South would secure Ukraine. Army Group Center, the strongest of the 3, would drive directly toward Moscow. Moscow occupied a unique position in Soviet geography and strategy. It was the center of the Soviet rail network, with major lines radiating outward to every sector of the front. It housed critical government infrastructure and industrial facilities. More importantly, Soviet military doctrine required the defense of Moscow at all costs, meaning German forces advancing toward the city would compel the Red Army to commit its reserves. German commanders understood that capturing Moscow would disrupt Soviet command and control, sever communications between different sectors of the front, and force the Red Army to fight under conditions that favored German combined arms tactics. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch and General Franz Halder both supported a concentrated thrust toward Moscow after the border battles. They argued that maintaining Army Group Center's momentum would prevent the Soviets from establishing new defensive lines. On August 21, 1941, Adolf Hitler issued directives that fundamentally altered the course of Operation Barbarossa. Hitler ordered Army Group Center to halt its advance toward Moscow. Instead, it would detach its panzer groups and redirect them to support operations in other sectors. The 2nd Panzer Group under General Heinz Guderian was ordered to turn south to assist Army Group South in encircling Soviet forces defending Kiev. This decision came at a specific moment. Army Group Center had just completed the Battle of Smolensk, a costly but successful encirclement. The path to Moscow remained open, and Soviet defenses between Smolensk and Moscow were not yet fully established. Hitler's documented reasoning focused on economic and strategic priorities beyond Moscow. He argued that Ukraine's agricultural production was essential and that the Donbass industrial region provided resources necessary for continuing the war. He also expressed concern about Soviet forces threatening the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești. Hitler believed that destroying Soviet armies in Ukraine would achieve the fundamental objective of eliminating Soviet military power more effectively than capturing Moscow. German field commanders objected strongly. Guderian was summoned to Hitler's headquarters on August 23 to argue against the southern diversion. He presented the operational case for continuing toward Moscow. The weather would likely hold for several more weeks. Soviet defenses around Moscow were incomplete. Army Group Center's panzer forces were already positioned for an assault. Hitler rejected these arguments. Guderian later wrote that the decision had already been made and that his objections were unwelcome. Field Marshal von Bock submitted formal protests through military channels. General Halder recorded in his diary that the decision represented a major strategic blunder. These objections were not based on hindsight. They were assessments made by experienced commanders evaluating operational reality. The order was executed. On August 25, 1941, the 2nd Panzer Group began its redeployment southward. The immediate tactical results appeared to validate Hitler's judgment. The Kiev encirclement, completed in September 1941, became the largest encirclement battle in history. The 2nd Panzer Group advanced south from positions near Smolensk, covering more than 200 miles in less than 2 weeks. The German panzer forces met east of Kiev on September 16th, trapping the Soviet southwestern front. According to German records, approximately 665,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. 4 Soviet armies were destroyed. Soviet losses in equipment were catastrophic. From a tactical perspective, the operation was a masterpiece. But tactical success created strategic costs that were not immediately visible. The Kiev operation consumed 5 critical weeks, from late August through the end of September. These were weeks of continuous combat that expended fuel, ammunition, and vehicle maintenance capacity. The 2nd Panzer Group traveled over 400 miles during its redeployment south and its subsequent return north. This distance wore out vehicles, consumed fuel, and exhausted crews. Most importantly, the diversion gave the Soviet High Command something it desperately needed: time. While German forces were engaged in Ukraine, the Soviet Union mobilized its full resources for war. Factories in threatened regions were dismantled and moved east of the Ural Mountains. Between July and November 1941, more than 1,500 industrial enterprises were relocated. Workers, machinery, and raw materials were transferred to areas beyond German reach, preserving Soviet weapons production. The Red Army was also rebuilt. Millions of reservists were mobilized. New armies were formed in the interior and moved toward Moscow. By September 1941, Soviet intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack from the east. This allowed Stalin to transfer experienced divisions from the Far East to defend Moscow. These units arrived in October and November. The 5 weeks spent on the Kiev operation also coincided with worsening weather conditions. By late September, autumn rains turned unpaved roads into mud. German logistics, dependent on motor transport and inadequate road networks, began to slow dramatically. Supply lines that had been strained became critically overextended. Army Group Center was operating more than 500 miles from its railheads in Poland. Vehicle breakdowns accumulated. Panzer divisions that began the campaign with thousands of tanks now counted their operational strength in the hundreds. By the time the advance on Moscow resumed in early October, the operational environment had fundamentally changed. On October 2, 1941, Army Group Center launched Operation Typhoon, the renewed offensive toward Moscow. German forces achieved further encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. Yet these victories no longer produced the decisive effects seen earlier in the campaign. Soviet commanders were learning to withdraw forces before encirclements could fully close. October rains slowed movement further. When the ground froze in early November, mobility briefly returned, but winter followed immediately. German forces were not prepared. Winter clothing was insufficient. Vehicles lacked antifreeze. Weapons malfunctioned. Combat effectiveness declined rapidly. The final German push toward Moscow came in late November and early December. Advanced units reached the outskirts of the city. They could advance no further. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a major counteroffensive. Fresh divisions struck German positions along a broad front. Exhausted and undersupplied German units were driven back. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was forced into a major strategic retreat. Army Group Center had reached the end of its operational endurance. This was not a temporary setback. The structure of German military power on the Eastern Front had been stressed beyond its ability to recover. German logistics could not sustain long-distance offensive warfare. Personnel losses reduced unit effectiveness. Equipment losses could not be replaced quickly enough by German industry. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was transitioning to a war economy capable of sustaining prolonged conflict. The strategic balance was shifting. Germany had assumed that rapid victory would prevent the war from becoming a contest of industrial production. That assumption had failed. Army Group Center would never again possess the offensive power it held in the summer of 1941. The August 1941 decision had consequences far beyond the failure to capture Moscow. It transformed the character of the war on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa was designed as a campaign of rapid annihilation. By breaking Army Group Center's momentum, the decision turned the conflict into a prolonged war of attrition. Prolonged warfare favored the Soviet Union. The decision validated Soviet defensive strategy and forced Germany to continue fighting on multiple fronts. By December 1941, when Germany declared war on the United States, the Eastern Front was far from resolution. The decision also established a pattern of strategic dysfunction within the German High Command, as military advice was increasingly overridden by political and economic considerations. The destruction of Germany's best army did not begin with winter weather or Soviet counterattacks. It began with a command decision made in August 1941. The diversion of Army Group Center away from Moscow achieved tactical success at the cost of strategic opportunity. The 5 weeks spent at Kiev were 5 weeks during which the Soviet Union mobilized, evacuated industry, reinforced defenses, and gained time. When the advance on Moscow resumed, it did so under fundamentally worse conditions. The failure to capture Moscow did not determine the outcome of the Second World War. Germany continued fighting for years, but those battles were fought without the operational flexibility and offensive power that Army Group Center had once possessed. This decision did not guarantee German defeat, but it made German victory impossible. It transformed a campaign designed for rapid decision into a war of attrition that Germany could not win. The strongest army Germany ever fielded was destroyed not in a single climactic battle, but through a process that began when it was diverted from its objective at the moment of maximum opportunity. Once momentum is broken in war, can it ever truly be regained?